first, thank you everybody again for attending VECAN's Environmental and Climate Justice Workshop. And thanks to the VNRC team and all involved for putting this together. My name is Sebi Wu. I am the Climate and Equity Advocate at VPIRG, the Vermont Public Interest Research Group, and I will be moderating today's workshop, facilitating questions and answers, and introducing the three wonderful presenters who are with us today. Again, a brief note, just feel free to text chat some of your questions if you have any that come up, and then afterwards we'll have 20 to 25 minutes of Q&A, and I'll call on folks who are raising their Zoom hands. You can find that by clicking the reactions button with the smiley face at the bottom of your screen and just clicking raise hand. That will be for after the presentations. And I will also invite folks to verbally ask a question that they posed in the chat. Just please try to keep it brief because we have a short window to do that. For my last words at the moment, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce a great slate of presenters today. First, Senator Rahm Hinsdale of Chittenden County, elected to the Vermont Senate last year as the first ever woman of color in Vermont State Senate. Keisha first served in the Vermont House at age 22, just after graduating from UVM. She's worked for years to improve civic engagement, social equity, and inclusion in Vermont, and she holds a Master's of Public Administration from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and currently serves in the Senate Committees on Economic Development, Housing, and General Affairs, as well as Government Operations. And of course, she has worked for years on an environmental justice bill she introduced in the Senate earlier this year. Welcome, Senator. Also with us is Chris Campany, Executive Director of the Windham Regional Commission since 2011 and a member of Vermont's Climate Council Steering Committee, Just Transition Subcommittee, and Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee. Chris leverages his years of experience in environmental policy and planning, sustainable agriculture, landscape architecture, and rural and economic development gained through various roles inside and outside of government to inform his current work on behalf of the Windham region and the state of Vermont at large. Thanks so much for being here with us, Chris. And last but not least, Amanda Carlson, Special Projects Manager working in the Climate Impact Division of Capstone Community Action, one of Vermont's 5 statewide anti-poverty organizations. Amanda's work focuses on improving people's lives through programs that increase transportation access and engaging with low-income Vermonters on climate-related issues. A self-proclaimed Jill of all trades, she has worked in such diverse fields as healthcare and emergency services and outdoor business management. Through participation in a town energy committee and education gained at past VECAN conferences, she was able to pivot to a career improving the lives of Vermonters and combating our climate crisis. So glad to have you here with us, Amanda. I'm sure everyone's really excited to hear from our presenters. So without further ado, Senator Rahm Hinsdale, please share your perspective on environmental and climate justice in Vermont.
Thanks so much, Sebi, and it is a great panel. I'm honored to be with all of you. Some of you on the call have heard me give this presentation maybe even more than once. And for that, I am sorry. And at the same time, I feel like I've been making some version of this presentation for 15 years. So bear with me here. And I just want to say 3 things. One related to that, which is I think after 15 years of having this proposal out there, I think we're finally going to pass it this year. That's very exciting. It's thanks to a lot of environmental groups who are weighing in, including this being a recommendation of the Climate Council. It's also a little disheartening because I don't think it's for necessarily the right reasons at this point. The EPA has been asking us to do this since 2015. We are finally so far out of civil rights compliance with not having an environmental justice framework that between the EPA and a lot of this external pressure, we're finally seeing this emerge as a priority from the Agency of Natural Resources. And I lament that only because I think it leads to the other 2 things that I want to say. Number one, that this should be a floor and not a ceiling. That's come up a lot with impacted communities, especially who are worried about the crumbling foundation of the Civil Rights Act at the federal level. And that this has been a tool that's worked for about 20 years in other states. We're just really behind. And this may need to sort of build quickly into other work. Many states are starting to look at a constitutional right to a clean environment. So I really see this bill as getting the right people at the table to start a much bigger conversation. And finally, related to that, it is a lens through which to look at environmental regulation and meaningful participation in environmental policy and practice. So, you know, there isn't much to it. It's not sort of like earth shattering. It's just something we haven't done, which is get the right people, the most impacted people, the communities who aren't centered in the conversation at the table, and have a shared language around what we consider environmental costs, environmental benefits, and what a distressed community is. So no big deal, right? So really quickly, just to sort of illustrate what I'm talking about, I'll run very quickly through this sheet. So again, my bill from 2007, when I was a senior at UVM, and this was my thesis, there's someone on this list has passed away. Someone on this list is on the public service board. You know, someone on this list served as speaker. There's been a lot of interest and iteration around this issue. And again, the EPA has been saying since 2015, Vermont, you're way behind. You're one of the last maybe 8 states in the country not to have an EJ framework. This came out of some of UVM's research. BIPOC Vermonters are 7 times more likely to have gone without heat in the past year, over 2 times more likely to have trouble affording electricity, and 7 times less likely to own a solar panel than white Vermonters. So our solutions right now are not going to work for everyone, especially if they can't access home ownership. I also want to be clear that, you know, a lot of times when people hear language, environmental and climate justice, they think of people of color. We're leaving a lot of people behind, regardless of their race. One of the most impacted communities is the mobile home park communities. And we're going to have a big conversation in the state about helping them move to higher ground. How that conversation unfolds, how much it centers the people whose entire communities might move rather than sprinkling a little money on them, is all an environmental justice conversation. So here's just a sort of flyby of when you talk about environmental justice policy, you're talking about substantive, that equal access that might ultimately need to be a constitutional right, the procedural, that you can't, nothing about us without us, and language access is a big piece of that. That's another bill that I've introduced because we're just so far behind on another piece of civil rights compliance, which is making sure people have information in their language. And then that distributive piece of environmental justice policy, you should not face more environmental burdens than receive environmental benefits. And there's a lot of disproportionality there in Vermont. So the bill has findings and definitions. The definitions are really critical. They're a lot built on Massachusetts, which is probably on its 3rd iteration of environmental and climate justice policy, embedding environmental justice into the mission and framework of more than just A&R, housing, transportation, et cetera. An advisory group, and that's a really critical piece of who you kind of return to for a touchstone on how to advance these policies. Expanding the part-time position in the A&R Office of Civil Rights to hopefully a full office, and then a mapping tool. And I think we shortened the presentation so that it doesn't include actually looking at what the mapping tool might look like, but it really hopefully overlays that sense that you need to look at where the disparity exists, where people are part of a civil rights protected class, where they're renters, where they have limited English proficiency, where you find people of color, where you find low-income people, overlaid with being vulnerable to heat, flooding, any number of measures. The picture I usually use is a lead paint indicator, which is another huge issue for Vermont. But we're benefiting from the environmental justice screening tool at the federal level, now including flood-prone areas. It didn't before. So you really see the rural context starting to be taken into consideration with environmental justice. And that is my quickest overview I could give of my 15-year passion to pass this legislation in Vermont.
Great. Thank you so much, Senator Rahm, Hinsdale, and I think I speak for everyone in attendance that we really appreciate your 1.5 decades of work on this issue. Now we'll hear from Chris Campany about some of the work of the Vermont Climate Council, especially the work of the Just Transition Subcommittee focusing on climate and environmental justice and opportunities to improve climate and environmental justice in Vermont's communities moving forward.
Thanks so much. Appreciate the invitation to be here. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Bear with me. How are we doing?
Good. You might, yeah, from beginning is good. Great.
Okay. So I've got two screens here. So pardon me if I'm not looking right at you. I'm going to be looking at the screen somewhat here. So Joey asked me to talk about just transitions work to date within the Climate Council. What does climate and environmental justice mean for rural communities in Vermont? And how might the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, and federal infrastructure bills, well, we have the one for sure, maybe have a second one. What opportunities and issues do they create for small communities? So I've got about 10 minutes to present all of this to you, but we'll see what we can do.
Splurge and have a little bit more, but we definitely want to get to Q&A too, but take the time.
So for folk who don't know, I was excited about this. I'll note that I did not, let me take briefly my history work on climate change issues. When I was in college, working on my first master's in 1990 at Mississippi State, focused a lot on climate change, and was around when John Sununu basically scuttled the Bush administration's efforts to try to move forward on climate change in a really meaningful way. And then I went to work for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency at the end of the Bush administration, beginning of the Clinton administration. And that was when they actually adopted in 1992, is actually under Bush, established an office. And then they called it the Office of Environmental Equity under Clinton in 94. They changed it to the Office of Environmental Justice. And I can tell you all those decades ago, there was a lot of recognition about environmental and social inequities. It's taken it a really long time for things to kind of roll out. And so I was thrilled to be here in Vermont and to see just transitions included in the Global Warming Solutions Act. After I left EPA, I went to Louisiana, which is kind of lived in Baton Rouge, went to LSU for another master's, and lived and worked in what some would consider kind of America's ground zero for a lot of climate issues, a lot of environmental and social equity and justice issues. So now I'm here working on these issues in Vermont. So in statute and Global Warming Solutions Act, it required the creation of a just transition subcommittee. And the subcommittee was to focus on ensuring that strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to build resilience and adapt to the effects of climate change benefit and support all residents of the state fairly and equitably. The subcommittee shall ensure that strategies consider the disproportionate impact of climate change on rural, low-income, and marginalized communities, and the programs and incentives for building resilience are designed to be accessible to all Vermonters and do not unfairly burden any groups, communities, geographic locations, or economic sectors. This subcommittee may adopt a measurement tool to assess the equitability of programs and strategies considered by the council. And this was great, but only one of the issues that I had with the statute is that it assigns this responsibility to this subcommittee, not the council. So the subcommittee, at least theoretically, has a lot of work to do now that the initial climate action plan has been released. The just transitions work to date. I am not representative of that subcommittee. I am one of the most privileged creatures to walk the planet as a white Protestant heterosexual male. We actually have a very diverse membership of the Just Transition Subcommittee, and they have been incredibly generous with their time and their life experience, and frankly, the painful life experience they've had related to climate and environmental justice. The subcommittee developed a just transitions principles and rubric. The rubric was intended and is intended for the Climate Council to use to determine to what extent policies that are proposed are in alignment with the principles. There was input on public engagement, request for proposals for consultants, and the work of those consultants, including the development of focus groups to provide information and perspective to the Climate Council. Members of the subcommittee served as liaisons to other council subcommittees. We also hired a consultant to work with each subcommittee of the council on the application of just transitions. And just to note that there is recognition that much remains, there's much work remains to be done now that the initial climate action plan has been released, not only by the council itself, but also by the legislature and agencies as they do rulemaking. As a planner, it's great to have public engagement and diverse engagement in the development of plans. It's critical. The problem often, as I see it, is if you succeed in that realm, is then to ensure that you still have that same level of representation when you get to legislation, when you get to rulemaking, when you get to program development, when you get to program administration, and when you get to program evaluation. And so as a state, we can't just let this end with the council. The pressure has to remain throughout the rest of the policy continuum. And so there's still a lot of work to be done. The Just Transition Subcommittee, Amanda also serves on the committee with me. I think we've got a meeting, it's either this week or next week. So the council itself is going to continue to meet. The subcommittees are going to continue to meet. And I hope I don't screw anything up here. I'm going to show you just briefly so you're aware of it. Are you seeing documents seeing guiding principles for a just transition? Is that what you're seeing?
Yes.
So I encourage everyone to go to it's easy to find by Google, Vermont Climate Council. You're going to see two different types of web pages. One's the kind of very Vermont agency looking site, but then we also have a much more user-friendly interface, another website. But I would encourage everybody to look at this. I think this is going to have impacts and implications beyond the Climate Council. Some testimony has already been given to other legislative committees about what these principles are, how they were developed, how they're to be applied. Hopefully this will have impacts beyond climate work and also into just work of the policy work of the state generally. And so the guiding principles for just transition, inclusive, transparent, and innovative engagement, accountable and restorative results, moving at the speed of trust, which has been a real challenge for the council because we had a lot to do in 1 year. Solidarity, consider the needs of the most impacted first, and it supports workers, families, and communities. I won't go into great detail here, but it defines terms. So this might be helpful for you guys in your work in terms of both equity and then also justice. Then it gets into who are the impacted and frontline communities. And it draws from key criteria. They are those who are highly exposed to climate risks, such as health impacts, flooding, and extreme temperatures, experience oppression and racism, are excluded from opportunities or have less resources to adapt to climate and economic change, bear the brunt of pollution and negative effects from today's fossil fuel and extractive economies. And to Senator Rahm Hinsdale's point, that mapping tool I think will be incredibly useful because I think oftentimes in Vermont we're not aware, and I would say this as a planning commission too, always aware of where the greatest risks are and who suffers those risks. So I think that'll be a game changer potentially for the state, depending on whether or not we're willing to act on what we find. And then these are communities that are more likely to experience a job transition as Vermont addresses climate change. Then it goes into the principles, all of which I hope you'll take the time to look at. And then there are self-assessment questions for all the Vermont Climate Council subcommittees to look at. And we developed a rubric scoring rubric to be applied. And one of the challenges we had was, frankly, just the relatively short amount of time we had to pull the climate action plan together. Public engagement was a real issue, real shortcomings there. And so a lot of public outreach has to be done now that the initial plan has been released. And especially getting to where people actually are. And I think, once we're able to with the pandemic, literally getting to the places where they live. I think a lot of the work of the council going forward is going to have to do this. But we had a year basically, and just to put this in context, the council basically had a year to develop a plan through which we were going to develop policies to reorient the state's relationship to energy, how we use energy, and how we use the land. And I think we got off to a good start, but we're stressing that the plan that's been developed with just transitions principles in mind, that this is an initial start, and it's not the worst thing to go out into the world with a proposal that people can respond to, as opposed to just a blank slate. But now we've really got to listen and really recognize this is an iterative process, and that we're really just beginning the process. As far as climate and environmental justice issues for rural communities, I'm thrilled to live in Vermont now. We love it here, plan to spend the rest of our lives here. But before living here, grew up in southwestern Virginia and Appalachia, right on the edge of the coal fields. If you ever remember the Pittston coal strikes, those were in my hometown of Abingdon. Later, my family's from the Mississippi Delta, and then also the Black Prairie Belt in eastern Mississippi. And then I went to school for a long time, in 7 years in Louisiana. And what I've noticed coming to Vermont is there are many people who are in decision-making positions to make decisions locally, and then also at the regional and state levels too, who frankly can live easily without really seeing where the inequities are, where the issues are. I think a lot of people just assume Vermont is beautiful, that we have no problems, but we do. And they may not rise to the scale of like the American Ruhr in Vermont, or sometimes the more visually crushing poverty in Appalachia, or in the coal fields, or in the Mississippi Delta. But we've got those issues here, and we need to own them. And frankly, we need more representation by the people who are actually suffering those issues. Because one of the things I've found here is that there are many people here who are able to live well and completely separate from the local Vermont economy. In other words, the money is coming from someplace else, or they've already made their money and now they're here. And so decisions that are made about the local environment, about local economic development, local community development, may not necessarily be as acute for some of the folk who are making decisions. And I'm not saying that's just the way our structure has kind of evolved, and we're going to have to be much more intentional about addressing issues and overcome that inertia and just the way things have kind of naturally evolved. So while we acknowledge the inequities and injustices of the status quo, we've had a lot of discussions about this within the Climate Council. I worry sometimes that by focusing on the inequities and injustices of the status quo, that somehow gives us an excuse not to weigh the equity and justice issues associated with the actions to change the status quo. And we've got to take those into account. The council, especially the cross-section mitigation committee, did a great job pulling together a way to, the package of policies to reduce greenhouse gases, but there's still a lot of work to be done on employment issues, job training, just a variety of issues. There's as part of the work of rural resilience, we need to identify climate vulnerability index. But frankly, we didn't have the resources to invest in developing that yet. So that still is yet to come. So there's still a lot of work that has to be done. We need to take the time and resources for more direct engagement. The Climate Council has a budget. I want to see that we're actually going to be putting more resources into the direct engagement to get out into the communities. I have a real concern about, especially the smaller communities, getting left behind. There's tends to be a lot more representation from our more densely populated areas. We need to raise awareness in our more rural areas. In my opinion, we need a greater parity when it comes to greenhouse gas reduction and the issues around adaptation and resilience. We can go carbon negative. We can go greenhouse gas negative tomorrow, and we're still going to have decades and generations to come where, based on what we've already done to the climate, the situation is going to continue to get worse and worse and worse. And it's not going to be a lot of comfort to people if you say, well, we're sorry that there was an undersized culvert above your home and that now your home has been permanently damaged because that culvert clogged up. We have to do all of this work now, and some of it's not particularly sexy. And also part of the adaptation and resilience is going to be looking at future development, and that's going to include investing in the resources, the infrastructure to actually make compact settlement possible, and compact settlements going to be necessary for future settlement patterns that can actually address the greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, from homes, and create opportunities for greater economies of scale for things like transit and being able to work from home, shop from home, have more walkable, bikeable communities. And frankly, I think we need to do a better job framing the issues and outcomes for everybody. I used to be, when I was in high school, I was a motorhead, and and I still am to some extent, but now I'm really fascinated by what's going to happen with EVs. And but so many people, it's kind of like guns in some respects, there's association, even if it's not necessarily conscious, of energy use with lifestyle. And we really need to have some open and honest conversations about this, not a blaming discussion, but really engaging about what are the opportunities that we have. And I think one of the things that Vermonters really value, or a lot of Vermonters, is independence. So if we actually, I think, maybe talk more about what, frequently when you talk about EVs, we hear, well, how are we going to be mobile when the grid goes down because of some big storm or some other activity? But the solution, and if we have to look at how do we apply this to everyone, but with a solar array at your home, with battery technology, and if you incorporate the battery technology in cars with battery technology in the home, you can actually become much more resilient in the face of the climate, the storms and all that are to come, and not have to rely just on even the infrastructure related to hydrocarbons and pipelines and other things like that, and even the geopolitics of what's going on in Europe and elsewhere. We can become a good bit more resilient and independent with electricity. But we need to talk about this more, I think. And then to wrap up, the opportunities with ARPA and the infrastructure bills. This is a once in a generation opportunity. I really hope it's a once in a generation opportunity, because I would hate for the cause of it to rear its head yet again, but who knows what's to come. The ARPA funding, it has to be obligated to by municipalities by December 31st, 2024, which means that municipalities have the opportunity to take their time and think big. This is not like the funds that came up that were provided during the beginning of the pandemic as either safety nets or as stimulus, where we had to spend money in like 6 months. Here's the opportunity to invest in infrastructure to achieve in the compact settlements that I mentioned before, to actually make compact settlements possible. I'm sure there are a lot of people here who are interested in the land conservation, a lot of other environmental issues. One of the keys to all of this is achieving compact settlement patterns, but frankly, we don't have the infrastructure in place to make that possible. So the path of least resistance is large lot, custom build homes on rural roads. And so to address our housing issues and other things, we've got to be able to have that infrastructure in place to make compact settlement possible. Challenges, we're still waiting for final guidance from U.S. Treasury for ARPA. And we don't, one of the opportunities we're going to have with the infrastructure bills is those things are looking like they're going to have 10-year horizons, which is great. That gives municipalities, some of them have the limited capacity to develop and implement projects, or frankly, even sometimes to really how to think about those. Regional planning commissions are providing help in that front to help them get their heads around this. As is, we're working closely with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns on that work. We need to do a lot of hand holding, and we mean regional planning commissions, but I would say everybody else on working with municipalities to have the knowledge and ability to couple funding sources to make the most of what they're getting. And then I don't know what the solution to this is, but we've got this challenge of the I call it the Hunger Games approach to grant access, which means for the most part, the best organized communities, the ones with the most capacity, tend to win, leaving others behind. So I'm not sure how to fix that problem. And I would also argue that in most cases, we need to be thinking in terms of grants, not loans, especially when it comes to infrastructure. I know that may not necessarily be a long-term, offer long-term returns back to the state to keep that funding going. But frankly, the loan approach does not work particularly well. I've been trying to urge state agencies to work with regional planning commissions, Vermont League of Cities and Towns, municipalities on how to best structure programs for success. Some have done a great job engaging with us. The goal, this is not a turf issue. This is about working with them and like, this is how to best roll it out to make use of the funding. This is how to make the funding most accessible. And so that's what we want. We don't care who does what. We just want to see this succeed. So I hope our agencies will be more amenable to really reaching out to those who engage in these directly in these projects to make this work. And that's it. So I'm not sure what time it is, but I think I covered everything. And I will quit sharing my screen.
Yeah, a lot to think about there. Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate it. I'm sure everyone else does too. And we're getting some good questions in the chat. I'll re-encourage people to ask some questions in the chat. And then again, after Amanda goes, we'll have some time to raise your hand as well. But without further ado, again, our final presenter before getting into that Q&A, Amanda Carlson of Capstone.
Thank you so much, Sebi, and thank you to VECAN for hosting this conference. I feel humbled to be able to speak next to Senator Rahm, Hinsdale, and Chris. So let me just share my screen. Everyone see this? Are we seeing this?
Looks, yep, there we go. I see.
Okay, great. So yes, as Sebi said, my name is Amanda Carlson, and I'm a project manager at Capstone in their climate impact department. And I'll be talking to you today about some programs that really aim to increase equity and combat climate change. So just briefly, a quick intro on what community action agencies are, because before I came to Capstone, I didn't necessarily know. So community action agencies can be found nationwide. They were born from President Johnson's War on Poverty in the 1960s. There are 5 that serve the state of Vermont in each region. And as this list shows, they cover everything from the basic necessities, food and housing, and ranging to micro business development and incubating new businesses. So before I get into the specific climate impact programs, I just want to highlight the necessity to bring all Vermonters along as we decarbonize. As this chart shows, 39% of Vermonters, the biggest group, falls into the lowest income bracket. And as Senator Rahm and Chris highlighted, low-income Vermonters spend the biggest portion of their income on energy and experience the worst effects of climate change. So it's really imperative that we bring people along as our economy and our world transforms. So community action agencies are working directly to implement programs to bring all Vermonters along. So just looking at some of the programs that we house, weatherization is the longest standing program at community action agencies, and about 1,000 homes a year get weatherized through our services. And as the services are free, the waiting list can be pretty long, but there's some nice measures that are embedded into that application process, which really prioritize the most people in need, such as elevating those at the lowest income tier, elevating elderly, people living with disability, families with young children, and it's a nice comprehensive service. As I mentioned, embedding equity in these programs, it's a really fine dance that social service providers work with, of creating an application process that doesn't discourage people from applying for these services, but also brings to the surface the people who are most in need. So while I'm talking about ease of application, I want to talk about our Mileage Smart program, which Capstone hosts for community action agencies statewide. And that program is very easy to apply to. And for those of you who don't know, Mileage Smart Vermont gets low to moderate income Vermonters a $5,000 incentive off a used hybrid or electric vehicle. And the program is small, lean, and mean, and people can apply to the program and have the incentive applied towards the vehicle either that day or the following day. It's a really can be used pretty swiftly. So for clients that we're serving, if they're trying to get a vehicle today or tomorrow because their car broke down, we can really help people get into that. A program that's not on this slide, which is being rolled out next year, is the Replace Your Ride program, which is essentially a cash for clunkers program that will get people up to $3,000 off trading in an older high emitting vehicle. And we're really excited because that incentive will be able to stack on top of the Mileage Smart incentive. So up to $8,000 off a efficient vehicle is really substantial. And another service that the community action agencies are rolling out, this program is in development, but will be implemented next year, is our financial and energy coaching program. So we already have financial coaches at the community action agencies statewide. And now we're going to be merging that financial literacy and coaching people about savings for energy vehicles and how they can plan for making these changes and be able to take advantage of opportunities that are rolling out with Arpa and the Climate Council and all the exciting things happening in the years to come. This is the project I'm most excited about and I have the most hands-on with, which is what Capstone is dubbing our Mobility and Equity Program. It is yet to be branded, so don't look for this program in a year. Google, there'll be a nice snazzy name. And this essentially is going to be a rural Uber service, and we'll have an all-electric vehicle fleet and really targeting times of day that public transit doesn't run, because we're aware that people working low-wage jobs need access early morning, weekends, later in the evening if they're working second shift. Oops. So this pilot will start in central Vermont, and we expect it to roll out next year sometime. And as we've learned, as Chris mentioned, I was part of the Just Transition Subcommittee, mostly as a scribe, but it's been an education in how to properly do public outreach. And I'm really taking this into the development of this mobility and equity program. How can we go out into communities and solicit feedback and hear from people who are experiencing mobility challenges day to day? Because I have the privilege of turning on my car and going where I want, when I want. So actually talking to people who don't have the privilege of being able to drive, or they don't have a vehicle that's reliable, and hearing what their ideas are to help us shape the details of this program. And this last slide of mine was in the Energy Action Network progress report, and it really just highlights that the lower income brackets are spending the greatest proportion of their income on fuel costs. And this is even more so highlighted in this year with a high fuel cost, and these bars are likely higher now. So on the ground, that looks like trade-offs. Are people spending $20 on gas because that $20 isn't going to get them as far as it did last year? Or are they spending $10 on gas and $10 on groceries? So we're thinking about programs that get people off of price volatile fuels and are healthier and save them money. So we look forward to rolling out our programs and working with statewide partners to do so. And that's all I really have for you. Creating equitable solutions is necessary to create a low carbon future, and making sure all Vermonters come along. Oops.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for your work. It's so important. And so now we are going to transition to the Q&A section. We've got some time, which is really exciting. And there has been some buzz in the chat if people have been following. I would encourage folks who did enter speaker view to enter gallery mode so that we can see folks. And I'll remind folks that if you go to the reactions, and you can raise your hand there. Reactions is at the bottom of your Zoom panel. I have seen some questions and interest about Senator Rahm Hinsdale S-148 and the idea of the Civilian Climate Corps. I'm wondering if you could let folks know what they can do to help out with passing S-148 and a little bit more information about the Civilian Climate Corps.
Yeah, thanks, Sebi. So in terms of passing S-148, you know, I look to Sebi as well. I think we've gotten a lot of good coalition building from Sunrise and Middlebury to, you know, a lot of the environmental groups in Montpelier. I think if you know somebody who has a frontline experience, you know, has been impacted by flooding, is part of a protected class, you know, would benefit from the state having a deeper focus on those who are left behind in environmental regulation. And I truly mean civil rights protected classes here. You know, I think the challenge is a lot of people will look at an environmental, an undesirable land use like blight or, you know, a solar farm or whatever it might be, and say, that's environmental injustice. I need your help sort of making it clear that unless we're talking about those already most impacted, they will be further impacted by those with political power saying, I'm experiencing environmental justice, I want this moved somewhere else. When we do that, we move you know, undesirable land use and environmental costs to communities where they lack political power. And that is environmental injustice. So I think helping us change how we are framing this and how we talk about what environmental injustice is going to be really critical as this moves through the session. Otherwise, it does become another tool for people to use who already have political power and are able to push things out of their community. This is about distributing burdens equally, not waving a magic wand and not having environmental burdens. That's sort of not what we're going to be able to accomplish. You know, to the Civilian Climate Corps, I have been having a long conversation with Vermont Youth Conservation Corps, with Serve Vermont, with a lot of the weatherization folks in the state I'm looking at models that are specifically add more funding to that what otherwise might be an AmeriCorps stipend that is pretty untenable if you already come from a low-income background. If you don't have someone who can help supplement your housing support or your income, it's very hard to then get a foothold in the Eco AmeriCorps or existing programs. So we're going to be, I think trying to add to see what comes federally and add a supplemental benefit. So it will involve an appropriation. So talking to people on the appropriations committee about the value of this is important. That is where the conversation was happening last year when we tried to get a little bit of money to study this and bring the right stakeholders around the table. VYCC, Resource, and other partners thankfully tried to do that without getting an appropriation. But I also think they're looking for that other BIPOC-led social justice partner to help make sure that they really are creating a climate workforce of the future. So continuing to share the idea, but circle back to me with ideas about how to improve it, because we're just trying to take models that are justice-based that we know work, look at what's coming federally, and bring the right stakeholders together in the state to make this viable by the end of session. So could use all the help I can get.
Really appreciate that, Senator Rahm Hinsdale, and a really important point about sort of the cumulative impacts piece and sort of guarding against that, the pervasive type of NIMBYism. So I appreciate that point. And yeah, workforce is really important. And it seems like a theme sort of has emerged, unsurprisingly, about what local stakeholders can sort of do with all this legislative action. I'm wondering, Chris, if you would be able to sort of weave together some reflections about the role of town plans and energy committees with regard to the legislation, as well as the role of select boards. That's from Guy and Deirdre.
Sure. So I think the role of energy committee is going to be really important going forward. They've done a great job in our region, for towns that have them, to really help push out make people aware of the availability of the weatherization programs and awareness of weatherization. The concern that I have, and I raised it a lot during the council, and this is just coming from, I was appointed to represent from a municipal perspective. And because we serve so many towns, we serve 27 towns in the Windham region. One of the concerns I have is we really need to be aware of what can be done by municipalities in a timely manner to achieve the goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act, especially, and I would not only on the greenhouse gas reduction side, which frankly there may be some limitations there to what towns can do, but especially on the resilience and adaptation side of the equation. Just a quick summary, towns, they have a choice to plan or not. They don't have to develop a town plan. They don't have to implement their plan. Frankly, the way the statute is the state planning statute's written is, they may choose to follow the state planning goals. They don't have to. There are 8-year time horizons for either adopting a new plan or re-adopting a plan. And that applies to regional commissions too. And so the challenge comes if you need to move quickly, especially on climate adaptation and resilience, do towns actually have the political and operational capacity to make the change that's needed happen? And an example of that policy that I use all the time is state river corridor policy, where it's at the town's option to adopt flood hazard and river corridor bylaws. The number of towns that have done that post Irene has really shrunken. I think the take rate now is really low, because it's just really difficult at a municipal level to adopt, especially the river corridor bylaws. It's easier for them to adopt flood hazard bylaws because of the general demand of people to be able to access the flood insurance programs. But then when it comes to actually administering the flood hazard bylaws and then river corridor bylaws, a lot of our town zoning administrators just don't have a lot of experience doing that. Some of these permitting processes can be very technical. And there's, beyond the training we offer, the RPCs offer, and agencies, there's no requirement for training. And so I think we just need to have a real honest conversation about what towns can realistically do and where is that line between local engagement and participation and actual execution of statewide policies, especially those related to life safety. And that's not to diminish the greenhouse gas reduction pieces of the puzzle. Those are absolutely essential too. We've got to do both. We've got to walk and chew gum at the same time. I look at the greenhouse gas reduction policy as critical life safety policy for generations that'll come after us. So to the town plan select board question, I think as a state, we just really have to look at that. And then within our own towns, within our municipalities, we really have to create a demand to recognize these policies are needed and to have conversations within our communities about why it's hard to have these, why we need to have what are oftentimes very difficult, politically difficult conversations about why land use policy needs to be implemented in the first place. I refer to Chapter 117, Chapter 24, the state land use goals that are in Section 4302. I refer to them as kind of the planning Christmas tree. Oftentimes, every legislative session, we want to add another ornament to the tree, and it's nice to look at. The challenge is actually implementing those things, and just by putting them as a requirement or a goal in statute, it's not going to make them happen. And oftentimes, there's very passive language in there. So, like the language around current language around climate adaptation resilience and statute is towns should consider. Especially flood hazard at river corridor bylaws, and encourage that development not take place there. It doesn't require them to do that. It says encourage. So anyway, I probably over answered that question.
I think that was great. That was a great answer. I saw Spence and Fran Putnam raise their hand, and they've posed a couple questions. I would invite you to verbally pose them if you would like.
Yes, it was my question, and Joey answered it. It was about what we can do about landlords who don't want to help with getting weatherization, and the tenants have to pay the fuel bills, and that's an equity issue. But Joey said that I should look at page 88 to 90, and I assume that's in the climate action plan, pathways 1 and strategy 2, because this is a clear problem with our energy committee when we try to work with rental people who rent rather than own. It's a nightmare. So I hope that there's some way to fix that problem.
Thanks, Fran. So Amanda, Chris used the phrase that I really appreciated, and this is also a theme that's been coming up in some of the questions about the policy continuum. And so, we often, if we are advocating for policies, we think maybe on the ground it will just come out perfectly, and you are on the ground implementing a lot of this. And so whether it's towns who have less capacity to write grants, as Chris was talking about, or folks who just may not have time to research all of the programs that are made available. I'm wondering if you can speak to sort of that paradox of reaching the least reachable and how you navigate that on the ground.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Sebi. And I wanted to follow up to Allie's question in the chat, which speaks to that about effective engagement. I think speaking to how community action agencies can work with town energy committees, I know that we've connected with town energy committees at VECAN in the past, and we're able to give you information and give you more specifics on the services that we provide in person, which is always really nice. And I would just say that respectively throughout the state, community action agencies, the door or the phone line's always open, and people are really interested in helping out our local town energy committees with a basic question or sending them literature. And then just talking about effective engagement and how we can really engage the low-income community on these programs and things happening statewide. First, let it be said that I'm not an expert, and I don't think anyone's really nailed the perfect formula, but really meeting people where they're at, I would say, is the most important thing. And it's really challenging in this Zoom climate because people that have really busy lives and a lot of children and are stretched thin for resources, and one of those resources being time, they often don't have time or capacity to hop on a call like this. So COVID has certainly made it more challenging. A program or a project I'm working on that I didn't mention is doing this exact thing of engaging low-income communities in the climate space, just like making the connection for people between how the climate crisis is disproportionately affecting them and how can we build a coalition of people to advocate for themselves and bring their voice to these state conversations. So some things that we're thinking about is meeting people in person at food drops, senior centers, grocery stores, people going places where people go day to day, taking a couple minutes of their time versus asking them to hop on a call for an hour. And then something we discussed at the Climate Council at length is compensating people for their time, providing childcare for public events, food, kind of basic stuff, but certainly a challenging group of people to reach, but the most important group of people to reach. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for those reflections and your continued work. So from Spence and Fran Putnam a bit ago in the chat about looking forward in the Climate Council process. The question is, if the public engagement results in suggestions for changes to the cap, will they be incorporated, or is the cap a done deal? How can new ideas be incorporated into the work that the Climate Council has already done, especially in relation to the just transition rubric? So, you know, the December 1st release of the Climate Action Plan is a big, long anticipated first step. A lot of folks are looking to the legislature and the Agency of Natural Resources for rulemaking now. I'm wondering, Chris or Amanda, if you could reflect on how you see the work of the Climate Council moving forward and what that public engagement iterative process is going to look like.
I can make just one quick comment to start. As Chris said earlier, I think that now that we actually have a draft plan, it will be much easier for people who are stretched for time to react to something. And that's something that we're excited to share with people that we meet out in the community, and maybe even underline some specific areas and say, what do you think about this? How does this look on the ground for you? So Chris.
Yeah, and I would encourage Joey to join in here too, if she's willing or able. But I don't know if there are other council members on this discussion or not, but I think that's part of what we're going to begin to discuss. We have a council meeting tomorrow. I think it's still scheduled for tomorrow. And there are some, we recognize the need to continue to do public engagement and outreach. By no means is this climate action plan a one and done. There's a schedule by which it's supposed to be updated, but we recognize the need to update it on an ongoing basis. There are even elements that are continue to be added to it, like appendices and other information in like the coming weeks. So what I would say is get familiar with the climate action plan. And if you have thoughts or issues and concerns, the council is still going. So please communicate. There's the portals are still going to be open to provide public comment. There's still going to be meetings happening. So by all means, please engage with us.
Awesome. We will. Senator Rahm Hinsdale, there are some questions about S96, State Planning Office, and the Climate Council's recommendation to implement work around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a group full of nerds, so this is something that people want to talk about. And it did get support from the Vermont Planning Association when it was introduced last session. I'm the sole sponsor on the Senate side. I think there was some interest, but we had quick turnaround when that was introduced. But there's a companion bill that has had a lot of work on the House side from Representatives Gabrielle Stebbins, Catherine Sims, and Tiff Bloomley, who, so we together have been talking to our respective chairs of government operations, first and foremost about how hard it is to think about absorbing all of the infrastructure dollars and all of the money we're going to get from the federal government without statewide planning infrastructure. And our joint fiscal office agrees with us. I mean, we are at very low capacity to do a good job evaluating, tracking, ensuring the best use of these resources. So, we had a lot of urgency last year. I do think there's a possibility it gets taken up this year. And I wish I could say it did more. It is trying to get all of the stakeholders past and present who have a hand in planning around the table, and some folks who are from underrepresented communities in planning, people with disabilities, people of color, marginalized folks in general. But to really hopefully rebuild our planning infrastructure that disappeared, as many of you know better than I do, in the early 90s, and to make it far more robust. We did a survey of the country. We might be the only state that we could find that doesn't have a planning office, and yet the governor's administration has insisted this is a solution in search of a problem, and we have planning infrastructure. We're not even tracking vendors and trying to figure out if we're becoming more diverse in who we give government contracts, who we hire. It's a very frustrating situation, and I wish this did more, but it hopefully sets up a 6-month out of session process to then return with the infrastructure bare bones of a state planning office for us to pass. I do think there's finally a little bit of attention on it, and if people want to amplify that so we can get this going, that would be really helpful.
And just a follow-up on that, you often describe environmental justice as a process as well, and you just mentioned the state planning office would be another process. And so I'd love to hear you speak a little bit about, you've been working on this environmental justice for a decade and a half. How do you feel like awareness and education and work has changed since then? And how do you hope it changes in the next 15 years, hoping that S148 passes and we work on this?
Yeah, I mean, wow. So when I did my thesis on environmental injustice in Vermont in college, I asked the head of the hazardous waste division in A&R, do you ever put information out in other languages? And he was like, no, I've never thought of that. We're almost still in the same place 15 years later, unfortunately. So, I wish I could say, I think the impetus is coming from within, but I have sat in a meeting and, they might have plausible deniability now or whatever, but I sat in a meeting with leaders in A&R where I said, if the EPA wasn't telling you had to implement an environmental justice policy, would you? And they said, probably not. And so that, I'm trying to hold that, it's disheartening because I think the only thing that's changed in general is that the marginalized community organizations are really organized now. You have active NAACP chapters, you have more organizing. Now the mobile home project is going to have 5 staff, which before it was 1.5 staff. And that was a tragedy in Irene, right? People in mobile home communities were 8% of the population, but 40% of those impacted by Irene. And they had, essentially 1 to 2 staff people helping them figure out how to address their needs. And we're finally learning from that, but it's very slow. It really feels like unless we start talking about equity right alongside emissions reductions, equity as something that takes rigor, that takes constant oversight, that has measurable outcomes, and I love the principles. I think you need to start holding government accountable to those principles with real metrics. And, that's why I think the planning bill is important. I don't think we have a lot of mechanisms to do that otherwise. But in general, the biggest piece about this environmental justice bill is getting on the same page about a mapping tool, because eventually residents and, community leaders should be able to look at that map and say, this is where the resources should go, not to who raises their hand and has the most staff and says, we want that pilot, we want to be doing the work. It needs to go to the most distressed communities. That's going to be your Benningtons, your Rutland counties, your Newports, where there's high energy poverty, high asthma rates, a lot of flooding, being prone to flooding, heat vulnerability in Burlington and Winooski, lack of language access in Burlington and Winooski. We are not scientifically getting the resources in Vermont to those who are most distressed. And that really needs to change. Otherwise, it becomes emissions reductions for who, and who ends up getting left behind again.
Agreed. So Mark Kennedy is asking about disseminating information and converse about it in local communities so that it is accurately, consistently presented and provides opportunities for people who aren't here to ask questions. I think VECAN is one piece of the puzzle. That mapping tool you speak of is one piece of the puzzle, Senator Rahm Hinsdale. So I would ask any of the presenters if they'd like to speak to any plans to bring everything to people throughout Vermont so that folks know what's being planned, discussed, and can begin to understand it and have input into it and own it. It's a huge question, and I'm cognizant that we're still sort of in this Zoom democracy mode, but I see Chris is unmuting, so I'll leave it to him to solve the problem.
So, that it is a huge issue. So in addition to the climate action plan having just come out, there's also the new state comprehensive energy plan. Those two dovetail in places, but they're not the same thing. So there's a lot of information to get out. We've got a bit of a summary that we'll be pushing out, but there's something like, Amanda and Joey, I'm trying to remember, it's like 238 policy recommendations, I think, in the climate action plan. And a lot of those, you have to look into the details as far as what it means at the town level and town opportunities. And by the way, there is a recommendation in there to establish a state land use policy framework and plan for implementation of that. So to Senator Rahm's effort. But one of the challenges we have is communications in the state are just so diffuse, and how do we get that out to people? I know when I used to teach planning at a university level, I would, the Burnham plan for Chicago, that was taught in all schools. Now I know some folk would feel like that might be, indoctrination or something, but it really wouldn't be a bad thing to create a cell for people, for us to, for teachers to have access to be able to use, to get to students. We need to get information out now, but this is going to be a long run process too. And so we probably need to think about, the folk who are currently in place in planning commissions and on select boards and on energy committees, but also those people who will in the future, or to try to encourage more people to volunteer for those activities. And I can't say how much I've appreciated the youth members of the council and the work that they've done and the insight they've provided, and really pushing on the world that they're set to inherit from. I'm just looking at the call. A lot of people look to be my age or older, some maybe a bit younger. I'm 54. We really need to get the generation of Vermonters engaged in this who have, from their own like personal planning horizon, have decades left ahead of them, as opposed to maybe just a few decades left ahead of them, and get them involved in budget decisions and capital planning decisions and a lot of policies that are really important, because I think we tend to get a bit stuck in sometimes either they're driven by inertia or just stuck in the expediency of what we need just in the right here and now.
Really important point, and much appreciated. Someone slightly younger than you who grew up around here. It's really important to look forward to future generations as well, which is such a key theme for climate and environmental justice. So I'm looking at the time. We have 2 minutes left. I think I will try to capture a lot of the offers and resources from the chat, but I will invite Amanda and then Senator Rahm Hinsdale to leave us with any closing remarks. And Chris, if you'd like to.
I'll just briefly say thank you to all of you on town energy committees who volunteer your time and energy and expertise from current or past jobs. I know that when I was an energy committee member, I learned so much from my fellow committee members, just from life and professional experience that they brought, and it's so beneficial for the state of Vermont. And also, as always, I'd love to see more diversity on energy committees in terms of engaging people who don't think about climate change a lot, and how can we increase or just engage our neighbors in joining an energy committee or volunteering their time. I know that volunteering people's time is a big ask, but always worth the energy to try to engage people with different ideas, different backgrounds. Thank you.
I think the only thing I would add, I really appreciate the focus on young people. I think our young people are doing a really good job advancing a sense of urgency, but doing it while centering those who have felt urgent and have yet been most marginalized. So I don't think it's an either or about moving forward in a way that advances the work and begins to reduce our emissions and have real results, but to make sure that we're centering the people who otherwise have been left behind over time. I just wanted to close the loop on what I said when ANR was saying they might not be doing this work, unless we were being pushed by the EPA. That was right after we had 3 years of an EPA regional director who came from Dow Chemical, who was not pushing us to do the work. So it's very fragile. It's very time bound. It's very much dependent on having federal partners as well that are willing to help us advance this work before it's too late. So, I just want to add that sense of urgency and making sure it's placed on those who've been most marginalized and left behind.
Thank you, Senator. I know we're a little bit over, Chris. Any last words of wisdom for us and ways to stay involved?
Yeah, just a plan is just a plan unless it's implemented. So the implementation, the council can push, but it's kind of like pushing a string, right? You can only get so far. So somebody else needs to get on the other end of that string and pull. And so hopefully the legislature will do that. The administration will do that, in spite of some of their signals about reluctance to. But really, it's you guys, it's the general public that's going to need to kind of get on the other end and pull to make sure that what's in the plan happens. And then frankly, to give us feedback about what else needs to be in the plan or what needs to change to make it work for you as a citizen of this planet and as a citizen of Vermont.
Let's do it. Thank you so much again, everybody, for joining. It was a real honor to facilitate this panel with Amanda and Chris and Senator Rahm Hinsdale, who had to jump. I failed my duty at keeping us to 1:15, but I hope it was informative and really appreciate everyone's time, and we'll see you soon.